Thank you for inviting me, Jim. I'm approaching this discussion tonight from the perspective of a judge, and I hope I don't step on any of your lines, John, because you were the attorney in this case. But from the perspective of a judge who in the year 2000, 20 years ago, was assigned a case in which the plaintiffs alleged multiple acts of mistreatment at the hands of certain Oakland police officers who came to be known as the Riders. And there were 119 members in this class action, and they variously alleged that they had been kidnapped, or that evidence was planted on them, or that evidence was planted in their homes, or that their doors had been kicked in, they had been beaten, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they further alleged that the Oakland Police Department turned a blind eye toward this and toward other acts of misbehavior, all of which took place primarily in East Oakland and West Oakland, that is, in the primarily Black communities in the city of Oakland. Now, fairly early on, the parties said that the prospects looked fairly good for settlement and asked me not to push them toward trial too fast, give them a chance to settle. And I agreed to that, and it made a lot of sense, and it was my practice to do that. So after months of discussions, negotiations, case management conferences in court, the parties finally agreed to a settlement, and they entered into a consent decree setting forth the terms of that settlement. That brings us up to 2003. The consent decree included a list of, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, John, 31 reforms is my recollection of how many things they agreed to reform on. And they range from updating their technology and their equipment, to improving their training of officers, to eliminating racial profiling and adopting new use of force policies and practices. And interesting to note that not a single one of these reforms was new or untried or experimental. Indeed, they were essentially the list of best practices done by every larger police department throughout the country. And I appointed an independent monitoring team to ensure that they fully complied with the consent decree. Over the course of the case, Oakland has had 4 different mayors: Terry Brown, Ron Dellums, Gene Kwan, and currently
Let me share.
Thank you. And at least 6 police chiefs, if you want to count one who's had a 2-day tenure after accepting and thinking it over and having second thoughts, decided it wasn't the right job for him, or maybe he wasn't the right person for the job. One of the more interesting aspects of this hugely troubling case is that shortly after 2 of the new chiefs came on board over these years, they had a chance to become familiar with the members of the force and discuss with the monitors what was left to complete and how it was going. They asked me to schedule a case management conference, which I readily did. And at that conference, in open court, with a court reporter taking down the words, they both told me that now that they're familiar with the case and what has been done, they can assure me that this case can be closed within 1 to 1.5 years. That was about 12 or 13 years ago. Now, what has utterly fascinated me over the extraordinarily long life of this case is that I'm firmly convinced that both of these chiefs believed what they told me. They really believed that. And I'm further convinced that they were correct. This can be done in 1.5 years. It could have been done in 1.5 years or 2 years if there was a will to do it. When the consent decree was signed 17 years ago, it was contemplated by the parties that all 31 tasks would be completed comfortably within about 2 years, give or take a month or so. And after all, as I've already explained, there was nothing cutting edge about these tasks, nothing revolutionary. So, just what happened along the way, and what to this very day prevents the Oakland Police Department from doing the things that it agreed to do 17 years ago. And let's look at that word, agree, because this is not a case where there was a trial, they lost, and I ordered them to do things. This is a trial, they sat down and agreed on things and said, we've settled on this. And it was actually, I'm calling it a consent decree. It was a settlement agreement, a negotiated settlement agreement, NSA, that they said, we will do these things. Now, here are a couple of the examples to the answer to the question I've asked. One, when new recruits come to the police department and they start their training classes, they're told by the trainer something like this, and this has been reported to me a number of times by the monitors and by some police officers who aren't bad guys at all. Now I'm supposed to teach you some stuff that the judge has ordered me to teach you. And I'll do that, but I want you to understand that this is not how things are really done around here. You'll learn from your partner and from others when you start working how things are run in this department. 2, in 2009, when the most recent chief held his first meeting with the entire force, I had one of the monitors attend that meeting, hang out in the back so that he would go unnoticed and just see what he was going to say. The chief began by saying he felt the consent decree was a funky thing. And I'm from South Central LA, and that chief is black and he's from Long Beach, and we both know what a funky thing means. And that it was a funky thing that led to frivolous, and that's a quote, and nitpicky complaints to the Internal Affairs Department. And he repeatedly referred to playing the game with the court. And he promised them that he was going to play the game with the court while he sought to end court supervision within the year. I immediately wrote and told him that he was off to a very, very bad start and that he wasn't likely to last long with that attitude. He asked to meet with me, and we did. So I arranged a meeting at my home, and I did it at the home because it was convenient, because Dan Lindheim, who was a former Oakland city manager and also a former policy director for Mayor Ron Dellums, and he was also my former next door neighbor. And he wanted to sit in on this important meeting and mediate it, or he didn't know what was going to happen. But he wanted to be in on it and help in any way he could. So anyway, long story short, the chief, in full contrition mode, explained that he had to say that in order to be accepted by the police force, and especially by the leaders of the Oakland Police Officers Association, the union that represents Oakland's rank and file police officers. Now, my 10 minutes are just about up, but let me sum it up briefly. All of these experiences that I've had in this case for 20 years, and many, many more that I may refer to when we begin our discussion and question and answer session, they've convinced me that the Oakland Police Department, and indeed that most of the other police departments around the country that are having trouble complying, simply don't want to change. The will is not there to change. They especially don't want to be told by a federal judge like myself, who knows little or nothing in their mind about the day-to-day hazards of policing, They don't want to be told how to do their dangerous job. Historically, our police have been guardians of the peace, guardians of our communities, who patrol the streets to keep them safe and knew the members of their community. But beginning, I would say, the so-called war of crimes in the mid-1960s, the war on crime in the mid-1960s, they have instead, police have become warriors. They've become warriors with battle armor. They've become warriors with tanks. They've become warriors with assault weapons. They've become warriors with shields. Really not much different from our military forces. And with the political clout that they have amassed, the huge political clout that they've amassed over the years through their very strong, well-organized police unions, I believe it's going to take a significant systemic and structural changes, plural, to make a difference in our presently deeply embedded, deeply divided culture. And until we do that, until we get to that point, I'd like to quote something I read recently, where police referred to as bad apples, and the speaker was corrected and said, no, it's not a matter of bad apples, it's a bad orchard. It has to start in the orchard and clean from the inside. And until we do that, they'll continue, in my view, playing the game with the court, playing the game of compliance, playing it with the court, playing it with the citizenry that they have sworn to protect and serve.
I will say the writer's case started in 2000. And right before that case started, I had finished a book tour with a book that I had written at the time called Blue versus Black, Let's End the Conflicts Between Cops and Minorities. And what I had been concerned about for all those years, because I'd gone through Rodney King and Tupac in a number of cases, and I really felt primed that I was in a position to really understand and take on a police department. And lo and behold, the writer's case developed. And we took it from the lawyer's point of view of what kind of changes can we do. Fortunately, we were able to reach some accord early with our experts and their experts to really identify that there were systemic issues within this department that needed to be addressed. I had tried earlier with crowd control policies with the department. I had some force issues before, but I had not had the whole gamut from beginning to end in terms of what police officers do to individuals and how they in fact screw up people's lives when they have ill intent. And so it was and Jim Channon, we were fortunate we got Judge Henderson, and to some extent, we were fortunate to have a defense lawyer, Greg Fox, who also understood these issues. We had tried many cases against him in the past or with him, and he had sort of developed a real sense that in trying to improving the quality of police in the various departments. But as we worked through this, and to be real clear about it, there were some very smart guys in the police department that worked with Jim and I, and we had a collegial working relationship, really trying to develop the very best practices in policing. And I certainly scoured the country, looking at various consent decrees that had existed at the time, looked at various best practices through my experts, and really felt compelled and felt good that we had reached an accord in terms of what was best for the department. And there seemed to be a genuine interest in getting this done. Now, I had sued this department many, many times before that. This was not my first effort at trying to do what we consider to be a pattern in practice. But once we got the agreement together, the department literally did nothing. And one of the problems that I think that they thought was that Jim and I, as co-counsel, once we got the agreement, we would leave. And they just did not anticipate our continued participation. They didn't really know about the monitors. We were able to get monitors, I think, that were probably, it was like, the judge may know, this was like getting a monitor that could have been my sister, sisters and brothers. They were clear, pro-police type, anti-police, anti-corruption type police. And so they worked on this with us for 5 years, and then they got tired, and they went another 2 years, and it was clearly clear after 7 years, there was no genuine interest in getting this done. And I'll tell you why this was important to me, because I was very much interested in the whole question of racial profiling. That was my huge issue, because I understood the collateral damage that came from when people get falsely arrested or get jacked up and put in the criminal system and get criminal records. So it was a big deal. But how to get at that? And part of what we did was we wanted to create data. And we all know about data these days, but that was a huge deal. And so part of it was that we had to develop these cards that allowed people, the police officer, when they stop someone, to give out information, you know, who they were, race, sex, gender, and the basis of the stop, etc. It took, and this was supposed to be done routinely by every officer. You know, it took us 11 years before we were able to get a good set of documents or cards, because the officers absolutely refused to consistently complete these cards. So it created real trouble. And I often wonder how in the hell I've been involved in a case for almost 20 years, but I have. And part of that is understanding that the commitment is to make the kind of changes, as I tell everyone, that has sustainability, and that it will be for the next generation of people in Oakland who will not know what we have done, but will receive the benefits of it. Unfortunately, that has not happened. And I think that what the judge says, I have firmly come to believe, that you cannot do it unless there's a political will, on the, a will from the mayor's office, city manager's office, the police chief, and you got to have consistent buy-in from the union and the line officers. Everyone in OPD has been trained on the writers' agreement, but we still have these major problems, and some of which just happened recently in a report that an investigation took place that clearly was consistent objectively. But I'll tell you, it's not just Vallejo, and I want to talk to Vallejo, but it's not just Oakland that we have this problem. These are serious issues that exist, whether San Francisco. I'm presently openly, actively involved in Vallejo. There, the police unions dominate that particular city. There's no political will to fight them. And now we're left to the courts as we try to fight them. So, you know, the reason why these issues are important, and many of you don't have to deal with this, but it's the everyday person who gets the treatment. I'm involved in over 100 cases now, many of them death cases, many of them beating cases, false arrest cases. A day doesn't go by when I have to deal with these issues. And so the question is, in my own mind, has the George Floyd killing, has it created a moment for us to deal with these issues, or is it a movement? And I tell you this, there's no movement and no pushback on the question of death shootings. I've had at least five shootings since then, all of which are, since George Floyd, all of which are questionable. So I have real questions about this, whether we can make any systemic changes, at least on the issue of force, maybe on some deadly force, maybe on some other issues, because there's a lot of activity that's taken place. But I understand and understand the mentality. The police officers like what they have, they want to keep what they have, and they certainly don't like people like me tell them they got to change. That's just, and judge, they may be kinder to the judge, but they're less kind to me. And I have met with these folks in Oakland almost routinely, once a month, sometimes more than that, for almost 17 years. And we're still in the middle of it. And I don't see it changing until, I don't see it ending, certainly over the next 2 years. So that's the challenge that is before us. And I only say it's not just Oakland, the challenge, it is other departments as well that have these high incidents of brutality, death cases, mistreatment of African Americans and Hispanic people.
John, I have a question of you from the 60s. When I remember the Oakland Police Department, and it was predominantly white, almost totally white. And one of the reforms suggested was that if there were more members in the Oakland Police Department who were of color, they not only would they bring a reform attitude, but they would also kind of be a check and balance against others. And I was thinking of it recently. I was in Belfast, and I had to do with their police department on a murder case, actually. And they, of course, they're all Protestants. I was thinking of Oakland in those days. What has occurred with regard to the addition of officers of race, and has it made any difference?
Well, I will say this, that Black officers who come into the department are people of really goodwill, and they really want to make a difference in that community. But I'm going to tell you, the culture of the department is so powerful that it restrains them, it controls them, and they don't act as honest brokers when they could. They may not do it themselves. I haven't had many police shootings with African-American men, or I don't have very many beatings, but I've had some. But because of the culture and the desire to stay in the department and move up, decisions are made that are consistent with holding everyone together. And I'll give you a classic example. Yesterday, the Monitor, in this case, issued a report of a shooting, a case that I've been involved in. And one of the things he said was that there was an executive board review, and the judge would know this. An executive board review is the top level of that of investigation in a police shooting. Well, what happened here is that most of the officers on that group, just about all of them, said it was a legitimate shooting. The one person who did not was the chairman. And he tried and offered all kinds of explanations as to, and reasoning and analysis as to why it was a bad shooting. At the end of the day, he voted that it was a good shooting. And he did so because the pressures from the chief and other people in that department was so much that his career, he thought, was on the line. And that, I think, is not uncommon as I look at what I see in Black officers in the department down through.
I want to recognize Diane Amon, who, Diane, you're in Georgia, is that true? And this is, of course, the cafe has enormous national ambitions, as you all know. And my daughter Amy was on last time from Minnesota. And so we're just creeping around the country and bringing our wisdom to everybody. It's so nice to have you with us. You were with us years and years ago in the early days.
That's right. Well, thank you. And it's good to see so many familiar faces. I am indeed, much to my continued surprise, in Georgia. I've been here for about 9 years, and I am not in Atlanta. I'm in Athens, which is about an hour's drive where the university is.
And you're teaching there, I take it? You're teaching at the law school?
Yes, I teach both domestic and international criminal justice for the most part. A little bit of constitutional law.
Well, welcome to you. Judge Cordell.
Yes. Well, first, thank you for inviting me to participate in the cafe.
Of course.
And Thelton, thank you for initiating the request. And I just want you to know that Thelton and John and Jim, you're my heroes, and you're my heroes because of the thing you have in common is that you're all three of you are courageous, and it's courageous people that are going to make the difference and are making the difference for all of us. So what I want to do is just take 8 minutes, and I want to talk about three things. A really, really short history of policing in America, then the culture of policing. I want to address it a little more than has been said. And then finally, I want to talk about the law of policing. And I think I can do it all in 8 minutes. So the first modern police force was created in 1829 in London by Sir Robert Peel. And his British police force began with 3,000 officers. They wore blue uniforms to distinguish them from the red uniforms worn by the British military. Some 25 years later, across the Atlantic, New York City was the first in America to have a modern style department modeled on the British department with 800 officers, and followed shortly thereafter in Boston, and then in Philadelphia. And today there are 18,000 police agencies in the United States. America's early police departments patrolled unarmed and wore no uniforms. and they were required to live in the wards that they patrolled. And in some neighborhoods, officers ran soup kitchens, and the homeless were allowed, it was very common for the homeless to be allowed to sleep in police stations. So police were more service agencies than law enforcement agencies. So it was a police chief in Berkeley, California, who turned policing in America from a paternalistic, service-oriented job into a profession. His name is Chief August Vollmer, V-O-L-L-M-E-R, and he served from 1905 to 1932. Chief Vollmer detested community policing, the whole notion of providing service. And he's the one that pioneered the use of police radios, squad cars, bicycles, lie detector tests, and crime labs. Policing's focus became a profession dedicated to crime control. The crime control focus isolated officers from the residents of the communities they patrolled and has limited their interactions with people to traffic stops and interrogations about crimes. So the optics of intimidating patrol cars riding through neighborhoods has created the perception of police as a hostile occupying force in communities, especially in communities of color, and perceptions that have become a reality in America. Part 2, police culture. Within a police department, culture eats policy for breakfast. You can have a perfectly worded policy, but it's meaningless if it just exists on paper. Those were the words of J. Scott Thompson, a former police chief of Camden, New Jersey. A strong union and a strong union leader creates the culture of a department. And that's a problem because police unions almost uniformly oppose reform efforts. Example, in 2019, the officer who shot and killed Philandro Castile during a routine traffic stop in St. Paul, Minnesota, had attended a warrior-type seminar. The chief then, after the shooting and the killing of Castile, told all of his officers that if any of them were to attend these warrior-type trainings, they would be disciplined. The union president, Bob Kroll, immediately responded by offering the warrior training free for the officers. And that same union president defended the officers who killed George Floyd and lashed out at protesters, calling them a terrorist movement. Closer to home, in San Jose, when a group of 9 police officers were discovered to have posted virulently racist and Islamophobic remarks in a secret Facebook group, the union's president, Paul Kelly, at first condemned the postings and called for the firings of the officers. But shortly thereafter, when the rank and file turned against him, he did a 180 and defended their actions. The largest police union, the Fraternal Order of Police, has more than 2,000 local chapters and nearly 350,000 members. It lobbies for officers through collective bargaining agreements or state laws. For example, the language of the contract with the police union in Chicago requires misconduct records to be destroyed after 5 years. In Cleveland, it's 2 years. In California, it's 6 years. In no other profession are misconduct records permitted to be destroyed. So how can you hold officers accountable if their records of misconduct don't exist? A 2016 survey by the Police Executive Research Forum found that police agencies spend a median of 58 hours training recruits in how to use a gun and 48 hours on defensive tactics, but just 8 hours on de-escalation and crisis intervention. I have my own army in the NYPD, the 7th largest army in the world. Thus spoke New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Police are not soldiers, but the culture sends a clear message that they are. Case in point, Johnston, Rhode Island has a population of 29,000 and covers just 27 square miles. Its police department has $4.1 million worth of surplus military gear from the Pentagon, 30 M16 rifles, 599 M16 magazines containing 18,000 rounds, a sniper targeting calculator, 44 bayonets, and 12 Humvees. Part 3, the law of policing. The US Supreme Court creates the laws that apply to policing. And for the last 50 years, since 1968, the court has endowed law enforcement with superpowers. And I'm going to give you the 6 superpowers that police have. Compliments of the Supreme Court. Superpower number 1. In 1967, the Supreme Court decided Pearson, P-I-E-R-S-O-N, Pearson versus Ray, and literally invented the doctrine of qualified immunity, which protects police officers from civil liability lawsuits when they're accused of using excessive force. Superpower number 2. The next year, 1968, the Supreme Court issued the decision in Terry versus Ohio. That decision gave the green light for police to temporarily detain and stop and frisk someone solely based upon an officer's reasonable suspicion. Until then, the court had allowed such stops only when an officer had probable cause to believe that a crime had been committed. John Terry, one of 2 Black men, had been stopped by a police officer in Cleveland, Ohio, who gave as his reason, and I quote, "They didn't look right to me at the time," unquote. The 2 Black men had been looking into store windows during daytime hours in the downtown business district. The Terry stop and frisk policy has been used almost exclusively to target Black and brown people. And there was one dissenter in that case, and it was Justice Douglas. And he said this: if the police can pick him up whenever they do not like the cut of his jib, if they can seize and search him in their discretion, we enter a new regime. Superpower number 3. In 1989, the Supreme Court decided the case of Graham versus Connor, holding that police can use deadly force if it is objectively reasonable from the officer's point of view. Superpower number 4. In 1996, in Wren versus US, and that's W-H-R-E-N, Wren versus US, the court allowed police to racially profile when making traffic stops. Mr. Wren and his friend, both Black men, were stopped by officers for the minor traffic infractions of stopping too long at a stop sign, 20 seconds, and failing to use a turn signal. The turn signal infraction was used as a pretext to search for drugs. The court held that whether police are picking and choosing people based on being Black was okay, as long as the officers can present a legitimate traffic infraction for each stop. Superpower number 5. In 2001, the Supreme Court ruled in Atwater versus City of Lago Vista that police can lawfully arrest anyone for any infraction, even if the punishment is a small fine. And superpower number 6. In 2007, the court ruled in Scott versus Harris that it was reasonable for police to use deadly force against a suspect who fled a traffic stop related to a speeding ticket. Now, these superpowers were on display in 2014 when Eric Garner was stopped and arrested under the Terry reasonable suspicion standard for selling 1 loose cigarette. Under the Graham case, superpower number 2, the police could use significant force if they thought Garner was resisting arrest and if they thought the proportion of the force was objectively reasonable. So as a result, Officer Pantaleo, who used a chokehold that killed Eric Garner, has never been charged with a crime. The end.
Well, that was fantastic. Let us see who has questions about all this. I would draw a distinction, a very nuanced distinction, I must say, between the FBI on the one hand and federally and the local. And as to the head of the Berkeley Police Department, I invited him to this evening, but as I invited him, the city council cut the budget of the police department in half, and he couldn't come, and he's thinking about what he should do with his life. Who has questions about what we have so far? Hands up.
I think, Steve, you were about to talk first, but then
Sure.
I'll go around.
I have two questions. One is, what is the role of political leadership in setting the culture of the police department? And second is an observation and a question. And we think of the police as a sort of quasi-military force, but in one important respect, they're not like the military at all. I mean, in the military, the general gives an order and soldiers follow it. In police departments, the chief of police may give an order and the head of the union or the rank and file say, buzz off. How do you circumvent that difference?
Well, let me just say, I think the culture question is one that is established over a period of time. And you would like to think that the political leaders are in a position to set that culture, but they really aren't, because the culture has already been in place. So the best you can do is move it in a positive way based upon practices that you put in place. But I think it's the police chief who really can set the tone for the changing of the culture, because some departments have changed over time. And the police chief has to have the ability to set the policy that he wants, set the tenor of what he wants, and then he has to hold officers accountable. And this is the real challenge, because that puts you up against the police union. So therefore, you got to have a relationship with the rank and file or the chief, the head of the unions. I will say in Oakland that, at least it's always been reported over the last 20 years that the union has not tried to get involved in trying to prevent or forestall the activities we were engaged in. Now, that's a hard thing to believe, except that it's probably true at the high level. But on a day in, day out basis, to the extent that the men and the women have not changed, and particularly new people have come up and have adopted the old culture, that suggests to me that this culture is steep involved, and the union to some extent is perpetuating this through either tacitly or directly. But you need political leadership no matter what. And I think that the mayor, the police chief must take a stand to show this is the kind of department that you want, and then they have to hold them accountable. That goes down to the command people. I mean, because obviously the chief, as you say, they could tell the chief to go to hell. But at the same time, the chief has to have command people, that is his captain and his deputy chiefs, if they have them, to institute the kind of practices he or she wants, and to hold officers accountable. It is not easy. When I wrote this book years ago, I really thought about the culture of the department. And to me, the culture of the department is somewhat controlling, and it's more controlling to me than the actual truth of an event or even the law itself that the officers are held to, because they're more inclined to be controlled by the culture. And that may be lying, that may be cover up, that may be any number of ways to prevent officers from having to deal and be confronted by other officers. And I think that we talked about it. The one thing I always remember from years gone by is the Serpico movie. And it left a major imprint on me, and even LA Confidential, that regardless of what the intent may be of good officers, the other officers in the department will hold them and keep them in line. So it's up to the police chief and the unions and the political people to change that culture if it's going to get changed.
John, but see, here's the thing. I think this discussion it's just about moot for me, because we've been here long enough to know that you can have a different police chief, you can have different people on your city council and your board of supervisors, and we still have unarmed people of color being killed. So I think that the discussion really, we need to start thinking outside the box. And for me, there's three things that need to happen. One, I have no problem with reforms. That's the quick fixes. That's the 8 can't wait campaign. That's a stop chokeholds, de-escalation. Those reforms just mean that when the police do interact, especially with people of color, maybe there's going to be a less chance that that person's going to get killed. But that's all they do. They do not change what policing is in a community, but it's still important to have them. And that means also independent civilian oversight of the police. So that's the reform. But then there's the second one, which is redirect, and that's redirect money, which is what they're doing in Berkeley, they're doing in other cities around the country. Take the money out of these huge police budgets, redirect them to social services. Still, you still are left with the problem, which is the police department itself and the culture. And that is the third, which is reimagine. So you reform, you can redirect, but you need to reimagine. So where has this happened? So it's happened in Camden, New Jersey, which had the highest murder rate and the lowest solve rate for murders, 16%. So and the federal courts got involved. There was all kinds of orders being issued to the Camden Police Department. So what they ended up doing in Camden was they fired everyone, including the chief. So with everyone fired, there was no more police union. There was no more police contract, the union contract. Everyone was fired. And the police department in Camden began again, and you had to reapply. So if you were an officer in the Camden Police Department and you wanted to stay, you had to reapply, but only if you bought into the new model. And the new model in Camden was called community policing. It's not rocket science. All it means is that officers are out of their cars all day. They are out walking the neighborhoods and the streets all day. And so with that change, there were a lot of Camden officers who said, forget this, I don't want to be a part of it. And there were some who agreed to come in. Within 2 years, the solve rate of murders in Camden jumped up from 16% to 61% in 2 years. Why? Because with this new mode of policing, where officers were out talking to people, everyone knew everybody's names, there was more trust built up, and the police were there not to beat up on heads of kids playing at the basketball court, because everyone knew everyone. More closer to home, that model is starting to work now in East Palo Alto. Now that's a white police chief in East Palo Alto whose demographics have changed dramatically since Thelton, you and I practiced law in East Palo Alto, which used to be predominantly Black and brown. Now it's predominantly Latino. It has Pacific Islanders. There is a smaller 11% Black population and a growing white population. Chief Pardini in East Palo Alto has come in, and he's been there now, maybe he's been there 5 years, with a whole different approach. He is out walking the streets, and he's directed his officers to get on board with this. This chief gives out his cell phone number to people in the community. He knows the names of people who are in the stores, where people live. And as a result, everything has changed and is changing in East Palo Alto. I used to live there, and I know what it was like. It was like the wild, wild west. And things have changed dramatically. And he's just very quietly gone about saying, this is what we ought to be doing. Are things perfect in Camden and East Palo Alto? No, no. There needs to be more work done on dealing with the mentally ill and the homeless, but it's reimagining it. In Berkeley, they have said officers are no longer going to make traffic stops. How do police do policing around the country? Traffic stops. That's why the Supreme Court has made all these rulings. You can do this, you can stop people in their cars. So Berkeley has said, no, we're going to take that piece out. So what will police do? Well, they will respond. If there's a chance that violence might occur to stop, fine, you call the police in. So what they're doing in Berkeley is redefining, by, in part, redirecting funds. And I think that's what we need to do. If we think you can put in a new police chief and just change the culture, no. The big, huge problem are the unions and these union contracts. And you can't just bust them out unless you decide we're going to start anew, which is what they've done in Camden. So I suggest, we think about that, because we're going to have this conversation forever. One last thing. San Francisco, liberal city. 8 can't wait. They have had, these are 8 things you can do, quick reforms that you can do in a police department. They've had them for years. And look at what's happening in San Francisco. Shootings, killings, no police officers being prosecuted, none being charged. They've had all kinds of the texting scandal, which was racist texting, didn't change a thing. So I encourage us to really think about the outside the box and reimagine what policing should be in America.
You know, I would say follow up on this. I don't want to leave the impression that no progress has occurred in Oakland, because that's just not true. There are some things around the edges we're not happy with, but we certainly have and do not have the same level of homicides or police killings that we had for a number of years. There's only been one maybe in the last 3 or 4 years. That is huge. The other big issue for me was people being stopped, the racial profiling. And what we've seen there is the numbers of African Americans and everyone else being stopped by the police has gone down tremendously. And that's been extraordinarily important, because those are situations where people are not in the criminal justice system who ought not be there. There's been a lot of effort and work around how to handle the mentally impaired. We don't have situations where mentally impaired people are being killed in a kind of a routine basis when the cops are called and the police respond to them ultimately by using deadly force. So I think that even though and there are other situations that we've been involved in. One of my big issues that have been uncovered, and I think it goes back to Jim's question about police officers, Black police officers. Well, one of the things I've uncovered in part of this work is that Black police officers are discriminated against in issues of who gets punished or not, who received complaints against them. This is something that came about as we worked through the case. We realized that I was able to determine that, hey, we need to look at what's going on internally, and this goes to the issue of why Black officers do not speak up, because they in fact find their careers called into questions through punishment of charges of different kinds. And so there's a lot of different nuances here, but I do think it has helped that it's been on the federal monitoring. It's helped that we've had a federal judge who understood those issues. We have Judge Orrick now. It's also a help that we've had plaintiff counsel who has stayed involved. There are issues that are there, and we think about, I think what LaDoris has said, look, some of these areas are not panaceas. Nobody really knows the answers per se, because it's all a work in progress. But I'm going to tell you, community policing has and was tried a number of years ago before we did the rioters case, and it was unsuccessful. Because number one, the officers didn't want to go there, and then number two, when they went there, they ultimately became just another drug task force. They were spying on the people, so the people lost confidence in them. So community policing has, in one sense, a wonderful title, but in practicality, you do have to control it and watch it, because it can, in fact, be misused, and then you lose confidence on the part of the community. The other thing that I think that's going on here, and I think LaDoris has been closely involved, and that is the effectiveness or not of community review boards. I was involved in the very first one that happened many, many years ago from a police shooting I was involved in. Now Oakland has a police commission, and they're trying something new, and they're giving the control of the department to the police commission. I don't know whether that will work or not, but I can tell you this, a lot of new approaches have been thought about and brought before, one of which is a big deal, and that is, how do you deal with people who are on parole or on probation? Historically, the police would just stop these people. If they knew that a person was on parole or probation, they got stopped automatically. Well, now the police commission has called the police department to say you can't just stop those people because you know that they're on parole or probation. You got to have reasonable basis to do so. So, and these kind of areas are going on all the time. I've been up in Sacramento where we had issues about racial profiling in terms of jaywalking. And we got the department to start looking at how do you deal with those issues. So all I'm really saying is that there's no panacea. I think LaDoris is right. There are different ways you have to look at these things. But until they get resolved, we still have to do what we can to prevent, one, the profiling, the beatings, the murders, exception, as best we can. And so that's all I'm really saying, is that there's no correct answer here, but a lot of work still has to be done. I'm not convinced at all that the Floyd issues that are developed will create a momentum. I think the work, those of us who are still involved in it, will still have to deal with this on a day in, day out basis if you want to bring about protection to the community that's involved. I'll tell you one last point.
Yeah, I wish that the panelists would address the role of rules of engagement. And I'll give you 3 brief examples. One, going back to the 70s, I have a memory, I couldn't find it, that rules of engagement became a subject of reform. And the one that I remember was that you could not shoot, certain communities adopted this, you could not shoot someone who was running away unless they presented a clear and present danger to other people. So you couldn't shoot somebody as they're departing. It's limited, but at least it was a rule.
Versus Garner.
Yeah, number 2, chokeholds was the subject of a case in the U.S. Supreme Court in the I think it was early 1980s. And the Supreme Court muddled it up and declared it to be sort of moot because LA wasn't using them anymore and all of that. And the chokehold seems to me unnecessary. And you could have a police department that would say it is. And the third one really has to do with the question of back to shooting. In the Woods case, Woods had a knife. He didn't have a gun. That's the first thing. That means the danger to the policeman is less. It's not eliminated, but it's less than if he has a gun. And as he was walking along the wall, they drew their gun. One of them drew the guns and fired. And as a result of that, all the others fired at the same time with a couple of exceptions. And that's almost an automatic human reaction. But if rules of engagement provided that, and the final one, 4th, I guess, is I was shocked to find out, which I did because I was consulting on one of these cases, that the rule they teach now in police is 2 in the chest and 1 in the head. All right? If you're going to shoot, that's what you're going to do. And I really was blown away. This was about 2 years ago. But the rules of engagement is my question. Do they do any good? Are they? Is there a department that has good ones? What do we know about it?
I think that Oakland has rules. I don't know that they call them rules of engagement. They have general orders as to when to use deadly force or not. And, that, like, for example, there was a time that when a person was running and you run behind they run behind something you can't see, or they jump a fence and you go in the backyard, they have to stop. There was a time they would follow them in and shoot them. But I think that it's the general orders that they do exist. The Tennessee versus Garner, I think that's pretty common. I do think that they will shoot multiple times. I don't know if I'd say rules of engagement says 2 in the chest and 1 in the head. I do know that it's to the chest, to stop the threat, and you shoot as often as you can to stop the threat. There's always an issue how many shots and stuff like that, but I think that's not uncommon. I think the rules themselves are applied, and that if they applied rightly, then it's probably not a problem. But often they're not.
Yeah,
that is the problem. So
yeah, okay.
Regardless, I always say, regardless of the training, officers don't always follow their training. They panic. They get situations. Their adrenaline gets going, and I don't think they think. They react.
Okay.
So,
Sam Miller.
This is Sam. My questions are: Is there any realistic hope of changing for the good?
Letting people do questions. There's a lot of people on this.
Through federal law,
yeah.
And if not federal, through the court or Congress. What about state law changes? Well, what happened to the rule that the police officer had to live in the community where they work, and would that be helpful? So those are my questions.
Let me just jump in on real quickly. There was no rule that officers had to live in the communities. It's all based on union contracts. And over the years, back in the day, they did, but over the years that has changed. And particularly if you look at, I live in Palo Alto, it's the 5th wealthiest city in the country. police officers can't afford to live in the community here in Palo Alto. The second one, the first question you asked, what do? We have these laws on policing. I think the most effective way, there are two. One are state laws. And the person who has taken a lead in California in trying to bring more transparency and more safety to the public in policing is Nancy Skinner, state senator from in Berkeley. She has proposed a number of laws. Some have passed already, some legislation that directly deals with bringing transparency to policing. So there are things we can do in the state through legislation that will, keep people safer. It won't change the culture of policing, but it will open up. And perhaps one good deterrent for police misconduct is indeed transparency.
There has been
the sunshine.
To follow up on that is Nancy Skinner, the past legislation, have really looked at this whole question of what level of mental state must an officer have. And we know under the federal rules that has been articulated, it's Graham versus Connors. Oh boy. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Graham versus Connor that has a reasonable standard. But what has happened now is that there's this whole question that they have to ask the question, even if it's reasonable, the question, was it necessary? And this is a very important step because it means just because you can do it don't mean you should do it. And so that is working its way back down through the training that officers have to engage in. And I think it's very important. It also means that you now get to look more closely at the tactics. What were the tactics that were employed in order to put you into a don't shoot situation? Because on the split second that you shoot, you may have had to shoot. But the question is, did you put yourself in that position where you then had to shoot? Did you create your own circumstances? And now that is something that has to be taught. And I think if that's taught to other officers, that you very well may have a situation where officers learn over time that you can't create a conflict and shoot your way out of it and then think you're going to be protected. And that, I think, is part of the new observations that are being made. And I think Nancy Skinner and some of the others in our state legislature are working at that kind of issue.
Okay, next question.
So David Bigelaisen.
Jim Brosnahan, you brought up what I perceive to be a distinction between the FBI and local police. That's not been my observation. I think that there are just as many problems with the federal law enforcement as there are in local. I look back to the COINTELPRO program, which was official. I look back at the way that the FBI did everything they possibly could to break the Black Panthers up, and many, many, many other things. So I think that we would like to believe that the FBI is much, much better than the bad local police, but my observation has not.
It depends. I think it depends in defense of my thought, which is nuanced. If you're talking about drug agents, they're crazy. They're insane. They break down doors. They don't care. And that's always been true. If you're talking about a time, it depends on the time. But there was a time in the FBI, this is a long time ago, when it was run, if it was not a political case. You mentioned all bets are off if it was a political case to the FBI. But if it was a bank robbery they were investigating, they were disciplined. And I'm talking about my time as a prosecutor. And it's an important lesson. If they made a mistake, one agent dropped his identification into the Mississippi River and he was transferred to Alaska. They had control over agents. And that's what's missing. That's the big thing that's missing here. Okay, next question.
Joe Groden.
Yes, I have an observation and a question. My observation is that to some extent, changes are a matter of state law rather than federal law. The doctrine of qualified immunity is, after all, a federal constitutional interpretation without foundation. It is not part of California law. John has mentioned the revision of the law with respect to the state of mind of the police officer, insisting upon necessity rather than reasonableness. And so there are things that can be done at the state level. But I interpret what Thelton is saying, what Judge Cordell is saying, and what John Burris is saying, is that we're not likely to get very far unless we can make significant structural changes. And my question is, what as a practical matter does that entail? Does it entail, do we have to fire the police force and replace them? And if not, what kind of structural changes need to be made and how can they be made?
I think that is a soul-searching question, because we all talk about right now during this period of time of thinking through whether or not recognizing and talk about structural racism that exists at various levels and various institutions. And I don't see how we get to any of that without somebody giving up something. And because there's systems in place, and systems in place will not change easily. I think that as I looked at Camden, because I'm close to the city and the people of Philadelphia, that I recognize that if you want to start over, the question is, how do you get to start over? I mean, what do you do with all the people who are there now? And I just don't see how that happens easily, although I recognize that if we just taking baby steps along the way, that maybe we can prevent this or we can maybe prevent that, but I don't know that we bring about significant change. For example, I'm looking at this whole question about African Americans being discriminated within a department. But what if we even that up? And so now a black officer comes in and he knows that he's not going to get discriminated. He has to stand on his own merits. Is that a structural change or not? I mean, I view that as a fair thing that should take place. I don't know if it's structural or not.
I think
structural makes.
I think someone like a Thelton could do it. So I really believe that if a federal court decided, you know what, I'm going to have oversight over this department, I think a federal judge could indeed say, this culture, given this history in this department, is never going to change because, and one specific reason, because the union contract, the union attitude is, as Thelton said, when he had his monitors go in and just listen to what was going on when they weren't before the judge, they never intended to change. So I think that a federal judge could say, given all of that, and make all these factual findings and have the quotes from all these people who are basically saying, we're dead set against anything you order, I think a federal judge could say, fine, you're all fired, you're done. And we'll do it in a phase. I'm not saying just abruptly, all of a sudden there's no policing, say in the city of Berkeley or Vallejo, but to say, this is how this is going to work. You are all fired. We're going to change the structure. And before that, you bring in somebody, I don't know, like a Jennifer Eberhardt, who understands about bias in policing, who scopes it out and the judge has this plan and says, this is what's going to happen. And I think a federal judge with a consent decree to work with has not only the authority to do it, but again, it would take judicial courage to say, we're just going to upend this. This culture is done. And bringing in the new approach and a new way of doing things. Again, I'm not just saying overnight, but I really think it could happen. And that's when the courts and judicial authority becomes so important.
Let me tell you that we gave significant, and Thelton knows this, significant thought to have, because we were not getting the results we wanted with the case, that we contemplated having the judge take over the department. And that was a huge, huge deal for everybody, and I'm sure it would have been for the judge too. Because at the end of the day, the judge is not going to run the department. The judge has to get somebody, hire someone else, just like he had to do in in some of the prison cases. So I just thought and think it's a much more challenging position. You can't have a federal judge taking over every department, as a practical matter. Some departments maybe so, but I think that those issues have to be clearly worked out and thought about as to the ramifications of it. And because we have found that it's very costly, even with the monitors and the monitor with the compliance officer and monitors, we still haven't really gotten it done. We're a lot further along than we thought we'd ever be. I should say, we're not as far as I thought we should have been, given the amount of time that's been involved. But I think you're right that you need a revisiting of how we do business. But the question is, when you do that, what do you next go to? And I think those issues have not been thought out well. And I think there's a significant reluctance to do that, even by most federal judges.
And I think that federal judges can do a lot. And I regret, looking back on my career with this case, that I was so naive at the start. And I didn't really know how powerful the police unions were and the interaction with the police unions and the mayors and all of the power there. And I would have done some things differently. But even if I had exerted all the power that I think a federal judge could rightfully exert in this case, it still doesn't reach things. There are several times, as you know, John, that I pressed and I insisted that certain officers be fired and things be done. But, accountability is one of the things that I haven't heard much of here that I think plays an important role. And I don't know whether that's structural or what you call that. But we've had people fired, but through the arbitration process and all the rules that the union has with the city, they go through a process that Joe Groden's committee, to which I'm a member, is working on changing the arbitration rules and all the protections that I think make the arbitration and trying to get to accountability very one-sided in favor of the police. And we need to do some things there, because if there's no accountability for lawyers, if you can steal a client's money and nothing happens, think of the chaos there would be in the legal profession. But within the police, you can kill people, as we're now discussing, and do other things. And in my mind, so many of those cases are clear cut, and yet there's escape holes, there are loopholes, there's protective legislation, there's protective judicial decisions that make it hard to get to them. And that's part of that structure, if you want to call it that I think we just have to find a way to change.
May I ask a follow-up question in light of Thelton's comments? Assuming, for the sake of discussion, that we all agree that substantial structural change and cultural change is essential, but that we accept that is something that is going to take a lot of work over quite a period of time. The question is it meaningful? Is it useful to push for more modest changes in the short run, such as the changes that our police study committee has come up with? Thelton is a member, Ron is a member, John True is a member of that group, focusing on disciplinary procedure, focusing upon public access to arbitration procedures, focusing on disciplinary procedures. Is it useful to push for those kinds of changes, even though they are modest in nature? Or is that going to get in the way of the more deep-seated changes that are required?
Look, I think you have to make changes when you can make changes. Because if you wait indefinitely or you work through some other events, people are going to get hurt. And and they're going to get hurt. And what you're really trying to do, from my point of view, is you're trying to minimize and decrease the number of people who are getting hurt, that is, being killed, falsely arrested, beaten up, etc. And to the extent changes can be made along the way to prevent that from happening, that even though they're not structural, it's a question of looking at what's in effect now and seeing what you can do to correct it now. I think that's absolutely important, because we're still talking about day in, day out what's happening to people. And of course, you want to have the long view. And I think that what we try to do in the Ryder's case is to take a long view about things. But at the same time, we had to deal with what was going on a day in, day out basis. And as a consequence of that, various things did come up. For example, the shooting that the judge is talking about, that person killed 2 people in a very short period of time. And even though the system allowed for us to kick them out, the other part of it was that the arbitration clause and the lightness that was there, that officer came back after killing 2 people, was not prosecuted, and got his job back. That's not uncommon. And I think that goes to the culture that exists in the department as well. Because if officers know that nothing can be done about them in a real way, they're not going to change. They will poo-poo the changes that are being made. But I also think you have to have a long view about it, and that's where the systemic question, structural issues come into play, and we should have smart people thinking about those issues now, recognizing that the fruits of them may be way down the line. But then you'll have other folks who are in fact working on a day in, day out basis. For example, mentally ill people. I come up on those cases with some degree of regularity. It's important for me to prevent that from happening the next time in that particular department. So it's structural, not really. It's really saying, because of this case, we have now identified a problem you have in your department as how you deal with the mentally impaired people. And so let's work through what you can do to prevent this from happening. To me, that has to occur. Or if you're falsely arrested, what was about that caused this? And so, or any number of cases that present themselves that have real harm to people. It may not appear to be that harmful, but they really are harmful, because either these little minor events can turn into major events, and people can wind up being killed or seriously injured or in custody and have their lives ruined as a consequence of it. So small changes have to be made. When they present themselves, you must deal with them. And of course, you have to look at the broader picture if you got people who can do that.
I do think I have one very small point. I do think that the issue of the size of the reforms should take into account that you have thousands of people in the streets all over the country on the issue. It may sound like a radical idea, but if you're not making visible progress and you have thousands of people demonstrating, what exactly does that leave you with? Who's got the next question?
So next we have Ronald Yank and then Martin Sibeli.
All right, everybody here wants to change
Kirk Boyd.
As do I. As do I. I think I'm the only guy in this audience who actually represented both cops and police unions. I did it for 35 years, retired. I got to work with John, I'll explain about that. Went to work for Jerry Brown, switching sides of the table, negotiating against 2 ex-clients. And then I was fortunate enough to get a job with the compliance director who was created by Thelton. And I did that for a year. One of my clients, by the way, before I retired, was the Oakland Police Department. And there's at least 2 false narratives I want to speak to. One is that arbitrators put dirty cops back to work day after day after day. That's not wrong, correct. And a Law Review article in the Pennsylvania Law Review says that 24% of fired cops got put back to work. Another false narrative, and Judge Cordell, I have no idea where you come up with this. The Judge Cordell said that there's no residency requirements because of police contracts. That's just false. It was either done by a statewide initiative or by a court case. I don't know, and again, I've negotiated tons of MOUs, contracts, and I don't know of one between police unions and management that says no residency requirements. They don't need it because they got it by a court case or an initiative. Everybody agrees that we should be changing police cultures. And again, some people say that unions are the problem. I want to propose to you that unions may be the big solution. How we get all of them to buy in is tough. And I don't want to be Pollyannic. The 3 presidents of unions in New York City are effing jerks. The president of the Minneapolis Police Union is an effing jerk. This is the Minneapolis guy goes and speaks at Trump rallies. Thelton, the union has not been the problem in Oakland, and we heard John say that. And John did have kind of a jerk president of the Oakland police. This guy mailed back to John, I think it was a $500 check that John wanted to give to the Police Athletic League. And this guy bragged to me about it at a Christmas party, and I wasn't even his lawyer anymore. But there was a new guy who came in. He's still there. His first name is Barry. And here's 3 things he did, one of which was kind of major. I mentioned I was part of Thelton's compliance director team. We all know now that cameras are growing and growing and growing. Oakland was the first major department in the country to have police cameras. And everybody knows the issue is, does a cop get to see the footage before she gives a statement or not? And the union was cooperative. Granted, I kind of was speaking for a federal judge, but the union was cooperative in agreeing with management that the way it would work is the following. The cop would give a statement, can't see the footage. Immediately thereafter gets to see the footage, gets to go huddle with her lawyer, comes back, and if she wants to give a supplemental statement, she does. But this model of wiping out a department, and by the way, as John pointed out, it was replaced by a sheriff's department. Who says those guys and gals were clean? We'll end up with a bunch of rent-a-cops who will cause far more brutality and maybe even murders than the existing sort of cops we have. Again, I'm not Pollyannic, but if we reach out to unions, if management does that, and again, you heard me say, some can't be reached out to, we've got a hell of a better chance of changing the culture of departments than considering all of them the enemy, and I'll quit with that.
Actually, Ron, I want to say I agree with that. One of the things that I come to better understand in our many years in Oakland, because it's been a work in progress. We made changes, we made adjustments. When the police asked for adjustments, we evaluated them, etc., and it worked. But one of the things that we didn't do that I think we should have done in retrospect, and that is had a public component to it. I think we should have had a group from the community to articulate their vision, as opposed to my vision and Jim's vision. And I, certainly we were kind of selfish about it, but over time, given this was affecting the community itself, much more so than our clients, because our clients are long gone, that it should have had a community component to it. And I also believe that it was important that we didn't have the real pushback from the union in all these years. We made a lot of adjustments to the contract because of what officers did. The truth of the matter is officers do bad stuff, even if there's agreement involved. And we've had to work through those cases. But I thought the present union chief, Barry Donlin, has been receptive to working with us on it. And I do think that if we as I look at other towns and other cities, I do look to see what community leaders are there and whether or not the union is someone that is a group that is interested in trying to work through some of the problems. They may not be, but if you can get the buy-in, you have a better chance of putting forth, quote, reforms. And I see reforms as the problem areas that you have in that department. For example, and I had the case in Sacramento, that was a jaywalking case. Well, black guys were being stopped for jaywalking more so than others, and they were getting beaten up and jailed as a count. Well, I wanted to deal with the jaywalking problem, and so we did. And so I see that you look to the problem, whether it's the tasers, you look to that, whether it's the chokehold, which is the carotid hold that goes bad. You look to that, or we have where you're pushing down on someone's back and creating asphyxiate people. These are events that you see that cause harm to people, that they're not the best practices, and that you can make adjustments for them.
Jim,
so that's also part of it.
Jim, I'm sitting here shaking my head because maybe Oakland is a special, unique place where you can get policing right. Because it's my view, my opinion, that this is all happy talk. That to be realistic about, that's what the whole Black Lives Matter movement is about. It's bringing the recognition of systemic racism in these police departments and how policing has come to just see people of color as suspect and everything that comes along with it, including the laws that have been enacted. So maybe I'm out on the left radical fringe. That's not my reputation. But from my own experience, what I've seen working as a police auditor, seeing what keeps happening continuously around this country, leads me to conclude that yes, I think Justice Grodin is right, that in the short term, yes, reforms they're good. It's like putting a Band-Aid. It stops the bleeding. But as far as really turning things around, I think we have to think bolder than that. And it isn't about, oh, we'll get a nice union leader and we'll get along with him. That shouldn't even be what this is about. And with respect to Camden, if they did bring in the sheriff, it was a transition. They're not there now. There's a Camden Police Department. So I don't know. Maybe, I'm just in a very different place right now. But I'm just not there.
I was going to say that the NACDL had an excellent program this week, which I watched. And in Detroit, the police department has declared certain areas in the city as green areas. There's a name for it. And they've set up cameras so that they're watching basically everybody who's there. Now, that, to me, and I think the point of the speaker was, is a police department completely out of control. We have not talked about technology and probably won't get to that tonight, but that, I was impressed by the point made by the speaker this week that technology has changed the issues as it has changed everything else in our private lives and so forth, and including Zoom. That has to be dealt with in some way, because that sounded to me like a police state way beyond any reforms that we're talking about here tonight. And it's fun to be a radical because sometimes it turns out 25 years later it works. Sometimes it doesn't. Next question.
We have Martin Sabelli.
Thank you. Speaking of terrible technology, right?
Yeah.
Jim, thank you for bringing up NACDL. I'm going to loop back to that in a couple of seconds. First, it's terrific to be on with three such courageous people. All three of you, thank you for what you've done. I'm hoping there's a role for cowards like me in the change movement. And I got to say, the 8.5 minutes that Judge Cordell gave were probably the 8.5 most informative minutes that I've ever sat through in terms of being concise. And so thank you for those. I am president-elect of NACDL. And the only reason I bring that up, there's a reason I'm going to bring that up with Thelton in a little while. But the reason I bring it up now is that we authored a report last year that was something I was very, very interested in. And that is the trial penalty. And it has to do with the disappearance of trials in the United States, the virtual extinction of trials. So I think one of the things that's going on here is that police misconduct is very easily swept under the carpet because there is very little transparency along with the concept of accountability that I can't remember who mentioned it. I think Thelton mentioned it. But transparency and accountability are buried under the fact that we don't have trials the way the framers contemplated. So police misconduct, particularly in cases involving mandatory minimum heavy sentences, which are disproportionately focused on people of color, those cases just don't go to trial anymore. And I can tell you from personal experience as well as academic experience, lots of police misconduct gets swept under the rug because there is no public light thrown on it. Now, that's a very legalistic perspective. And in a sense, the whole discussion today has, and I say this with care, it has suffered from being a bit legalistic because we're all lawyers and or people who are in the legal community, judges, lawyers, etc. But the reality is that the young people are out on the streets. I think they're going to stay out on the streets. So the notion of reform is terrific. But this other idea of reimagining, re-envisioning is the wave, is the modern trend now. And so we ought to be conscious of that for two reasons. One is keeping pace with it, as Jim has indicated, but also because we need to encourage it, because there is no real change without protest. To say that, I'll refer to a personal example. I was part of the training crew in the Joe Arpaio case, that the ACLU won in Phoenix, in which Judge Snow required the sheriff's department there to be trained in implicit bias. And I did implicit bias training with Joe Arpaio's folks for about 4 years there. And, you know, the notion of radically reforming the consciousness of most of those folks is a pipe dream. People, even if particularly if you really understand implicit bias and as well as racism, as well as express racism, it's deep in the brain. And so the notion that you can sort of train it out of people is extremely optimistic. There is some kind of conduct training you can do. There are some limitations, but the notion that you can completely reform individuals and departments who have this deep into their DNA, in my view, is highly optimistic and pushes me towards the reimagining Camden type model, which, by the way, you know, the Camden Police Department is doing, the current one is controlling crime much better through a community policing model than the old one did. So nothing was lost there. A lot was gained in terms of policing as well as community relationships. As for the FBI, this is a real problem for those of us who practice mostly in federal court. What's happened, particularly in the last, you know, since Clinton, really, it's not just a Republican Democratic thing, although it's more exacerbated in certain administrations. The FBI is picking up street crimes, and in a sense, they are covering for really terrible local police practices. We see it all the time, Jim, in San Francisco with the police picking up gang prosecutions from gang officers in the state, and they are burying all the misconduct. And so this goes to this notion of you know, police, you know, unions and arbitrators and that kind of thing. You know, so few misconduct incidents of misconduct are ever reported. They're just not, and when they're reported, they're buried. And so I'm coming in for a landing now. I've spoken too much. I bored everybody. I see everybody leaving. But the last thing I want to say, which is super important, I think, and this is an NACDL initiative now, but follows a New York model, and that is the creation of police databases, not just based upon and I'm sorry, I'm going to use the bullshit that the police departments put into the files, because a lot of that is very limited. It's reframed and it's often hidden, but upon the acquiring of information by community groups that is then put into a database and is available for anybody who wants to see it. And so these movements of making police more accountable, police misconduct more transparent, and technologically, to come to Jim's point, available to lawyers in the courtroom, in the moment, is terrific. And when you go to court in New York, for example, you see these legal aid lawyers are pulling up on their phone and getting people on bail because they're saying, Your Honor, this officer who's making this allegation about resisting arrest he's got these 6 problems with beating the shit out of people who didn't resist arrest, and they're able to pull it up in the moment. So, you know, that is a bottom-up initiative, not a top-down initiative. And so, you know, while we can have body cams, which are top-down because they're policy-oriented, there's also a role for surveillance, for community policing of the police, which is not, you know, I'm not talking about people following police around with cameras, but people collecting information so that institutions, before they're reimagined, and hopefully they will be reimagined, are made more accountable. So sorry for going on so long, but this is a topic near.
That's very helpful. And Martin, I'm aware that NACDL has a clearinghouse from public sources, about 7 sources, on police officers around the country, I think, who are charged with various things. Next question.
So Scott Sugarman.
Thank you. I have 2 comments, one of which is a question, one's more of hopefully a point of start of conversation. I've spent 40 years as a criminal defense lawyer, both as a public defender and in private practice. So that's where a lot of my experience is, both as in the trial courts and the appellate courts. So Judge Cordell got it exactly right. In Terry, in a companion case, the U.S. Supreme Court more than 50 years ago now, said if an officer has reasonable suspicion, they can stop anyone. And reasonable suspicion is a very low standard. No one on this chart today could drive a mile and not commit an offense as seen by an officer. I think there's a reasonable suspicion the windows are tinted, or the exhaust is too noisy, or there's a little not quite weaving or not putting on a blinker soon enough. So the question is, the law does not allow a judge to say, I'm going to suppress whatever was gotten here, assuming the person gets to court, because the Supreme Court says that's okay. But it does seem to me there's another issue here, which is the judge doesn't have to believe the officers if the judge believes the stop was racially motivated. That goes on all the time. That's what I see all the time. I only get the small percentage of people who in fact are arrested and brought to court. So I have a case right now that I argued a week ago in the Ninth Circuit in which 4 detectives from the Menlo Police Department who admitted their job was to look for violent crime and big drug crimes who stopped a man in the middle of the day driving lawfully for tinted windows. Now, if anyone rational thinks that's why they stopped him, we see the world differently. It's an African-American man driving, in fact, with his son in the front seat, seatbelted in. And in fact, there were drugs and a gun in the car. So the judge can't say, you know, they say the windows were tinted. Can you fight that? If the answer is no, but what was the real reason? And therefore, should we believe these people when they tell us what happened because their motivation, in fact, was racially rooted? Now, that's something that lawyers can argue, and it's something judges, in my opinion, can decide. And it happens almost not at all in the 40 years that I've done this. And I have Judge Cordell here as a former judge. I have obviously Judge Henderson here and several other members of the bench. So I'm not pointing at you, but I'm saying in the struggle about what happens, the officers believe they get away with that routinely, and in fact they do. So one question is, should there be more conversation about what happens in the criminal courts when these are made? And the second thing I'd like to ask you to think about, we've talked repeatedly about the culture in policing and the systematic racism in policing. Can that really be separated from the systematic racism in the community? That is the culture in the police department, how they see mostly men of color, although both men and women, because that's the way the culture has seen men and women of color. And that, I don't mean we stop doing one to look at the other, but it seems to me one of the things that the killing of Mr. Floyd has brought out more of it. No, this is so deeply rooted in the community. How much of the culture, whether it be in police unions or in just the culture of a police department, comes from the general culture? And so we have a much more difficult task, which will be a much longer task. I'm not saying don't do things. I'm just wondering about whether you should talk more about this, which is part of what's happening in the street. It's not just what happens to the men and women who are brought into the criminal justice system. It's what happens to many of those who are not arrested, but who are treated in a particular way, and how we are seen over 300 years of history. And I just wanted to, anyways, so when we talked about a lot of this, anyways, sorry.
Scott, if I could jump in and talk about just the first part of your question, which dealt with judges making decisions, were there times when I sat on the bench and knew that this cop was lying? Absolutely. Did I say anything? No. Why didn't I say anything? So part of it was judicial cowardice. A part of it was I didn't know that I really could. And let me tell you that, and that was, I've been off the bench for almost 20 years now. So what has happened since then was the recall of Aaron Persky. And the reason I bring that up is there is judicial fear. So that if judges today, I don't care what color they are, start making decisions by saying, you know what, I've listened to this testimony and I don't buy it. These cops are lying. I will tell you in a heartbeat that if a judge were to do it today, there would be a recall, there'd be something that would happen very, very quickly. And because of social media, it could be potent. So there is this thing now, at least within the state courts, because we have to worry about being reelected if we want to keep our jobs, about how much can we really do. So right now in the legislature, Assemblyman Ash Kalra is pushing a bill called it's either Racial Equality Act or the Racial Justice Act. I'm not sure what it's called. But what it does, it gives judges now the power and authority, if it passes, to question everything from peremptory challenges, because today all a DA needs to do is give a quote unquote race neutral answer for why they kicked off every single Black person in the trial of this Black man. So this law, if it gets enacted, will say to a defense attorney like you, Scott, you can say, look, I believe that peremptory challenge was improper, that it was racially motivated. And this law provides a mechanism by which everything stops right then. A hearing can be held. You can bring in expert witnesses, and it gives the judges remedies like putting the juror back in, or if it's a post-conviction saying the conviction was based on racism, reversing convictions, or even saying to a DA when the issue gets raised that the DA only seems to charge brown and Black people with these offenses, and you have a right then to have a hearing on that, and for a judge to have, again, a remedy. So this stuff is happening, Scott, right now to make what the concerns are, finally bringing it up. It's finally bubbling up. But back in the day, for state court judges, I really didn't know, quite frankly, that I could. I mean, I knew officers were lying sometimes when he gave me consent and I opened the trunk and there were 10 kilos. He didn't give consent, but there was no forum in which I can't put on witnesses and I can't cross-examine and question if I'm doing a preliminary hearing, for example. So as different from federal judges, lifetime tenure, they can do their thing and they can be courageous and don't have to look over their shoulders when election time comes around. So I think that's the big difference. But I think now we're calling it out. It's being called out. And I'll bring your attention to one last thing. There's a Chief Justice, a Black woman who's the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court of Louisiana. And she recently issued a public statement, a letter it made it public and it's gone viral, where she said, I know that we judges are we're part of the problem of perpetuating racism in the legal system here in Louisiana. And you could put any state you want in it, Scott, right. Any state you want. So I encourage you, it's online, you can read her
I will
statement.
Look for it, thank you.
It's a beautiful statement. And so, okay, so I'll stop talking.
Okay, next.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank this panel and for having this discussion. It's a real honor just to even be among this group, because I've done a lot of civil rights cases throughout my career and a lot of excessive force work as well. And so it's just wonderful to think about this range. And what the judge talked about, those superpowers, that really struck me. And number one in her superpowers was the qualified immunity. And I have to tell you, I have to make an admission that I argued the qualified immunity case, Saucier versus Katz in the U.S. Supreme Court. And I lost, as you all well know. And it was Scalia yelling at me. And it was really clear that what they were trying to do is to create this kind of insulation that qualified immunity is given. When Judge Henderson talks about accountability. That's really what qualified immunity has done. It's eliminated this ability to have accountability. So I have a couple questions in particular about that. The other aside I just wanted to make is that, and it's not just qualified immunity itself, and I'm sure, John, you get this in practice in your cases. As soon as you bring a federal case, and then they move to dismiss on qualified immunity, even if it's completely baseless, the first thing they do once they lose is go up on interlocutory appeal.
Right.
And I just had a judge, and she was upset. She didn't feel that they had any basis for going up, but didn't have any choice either.
Well, I will say that we've had this occur a number of times, and we have in fact filed petitions with the district court and as well as the Ninth Circuit that the appeal is frivolous.
Right.
And
I've seen that.
if we've done that and been successful a number of times, and it's the kind of thing we're doing more often than not, mainly because generally there is a material factual dispute.
Yeah.
And so it's been, and I tell our clients it's going to take 2 to 3 years to litigate this issue. It's about keeping you from getting results here. And it does. It enhances the case. And I was very hopeful, and I thought that maybe, Clarence was going to initiate a cabal, if you will, to bring some of those cases for discussion. When the time came, he didn't do it, but I'm hopeful that ultimately, given that it might happen next year, soon thereafter. But it is an important concept that is the bane of all the work we do. And I don't mean bane the act of California.
Yeah, well, I tell you, it's really, I'm glad to hear that you're winning that argument that some of these matters are frivolous and that they just don't take them up then. They leave it down below. And the other thing that, in follow-up to with the Floyd protests and why this is still very vital, is that with the Justice and Policing Act, which was just passed by the Congress, in Section 102 of that act, they specifically eliminate qualified immunity, which just gladdens my heart.
So the question really is, if the president happened, we get a new president, a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, Democratic House. It could happen. It could happen.
Yeah.
It could happen.
And Judge Henderson, what do you think about on the accountability part of it and qualified immunity? Have you seen that's been something that just you felt in your own experience that it has been undermining remedies?
Yeah, it's been undermining remedies. It's been undermining the whole strategy that a plaintiff has by the delays that you just referred to. But over my career, I very often, not as often as I would like, would deny the motion for qualified immunity and it would just move on. They didn't even appeal it, which told me that it was a frivolous motion to begin with, but they give it a shot. It's in the playbook for the attorney, and so they file it. But for me, it was a very unsettling doctrine that brought in a lot of problems because all the wiggle room that it gave the defendant to manipulate the system, in my view.
And then the last point or question I have really is for you, John. And now it gets after what Joe had to say, Judge Groden, about the qualified immunity and lack of it in the state. Are there times when, in order to avoid qualified immunity now, that you're focusing on just bringing state actions, or do you always hook in that federal?
It's a good question because it's always one that we consider. I mean, there are reasons why we go to federal court, even though it's a qualified immunity, just because of the order and moving the case along. We don't go to any state court. I mean, I just won't. It depends on where the state court is. It's Alameda County, San Francisco. But as a guy told me once, I had a major case out in San Joaquin. I said, look, I'd like to bring this case in state court. He says, I could bring that case in state court, but you can't. Okay? I got it. So then I went to federal court. So yeah, I mean, there's reason to do state courts, particularly on qualified immunity. In fact, we're considering that issue right now down in the San Diego case. in a position to fix your case. So it depends. But if it's in a county where I don't feel good about the county, then if you're not a local lawyer in a county, it's pretty tough to bring a civil rights case there. You know, if you're not local, then I tend to go to federal courts only because I've been in federal courts throughout the state and I'm comfortable there. But those are decisions all lawyers have to make. An SI is one, QI is one that if it looks like it's going to happen to you, you may decide that I'd rather not do it. And sometimes I've had it granted and I've not appealed it and went to state court. So, and sometimes the judge will send us to state court. So, which you know, as opposed to me fighting the battle out of QI and the Ninth Circuit.
Well, thank you all. Thanks for
good.
the
That was good. Diane Amon.
So let me just try to say a couple of things that haven't been said. This is a terrific, really rich conversation. I tend to lean toward pessimism, and I think baseline power corrupts. If you give someone a firearm and a badge, you are halfway to a lot of the problems that you're talking about here. And that is going to be true almost whatever you organize. And it seems to me that's one of the central issues that has to be addressed and thought through very strongly. I grew up in a very small, very white, homogeneous community north of Chicago. And all the well, not all, but many of the police misconduct, abuse, overreach issues were present in that community. The disadvantage switched from issues of race or ethnicity to issues of class, but they were still there. The favoritism went to certain families and the disadvantage to others. So I'm not convinced I think we can't forget that. I then moved to Chicago, so I'm very, very familiar with how race and ethnic hatreds can compound all of those issues. For those reasons, I think that thinking really about deep structural change is important. And I think that visions like Judge Cordell mentioned are also really important, although my comments have expressed some skepticism that doing some of those things will really make lasting difference. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but we can't forget that the bottom line is we're giving people a firearm that they can use against other people in the community. And that's a really difficult power relationship to negotiate. The last thing I'll say is that some of these issues are endemic, but I really do have the feeling that it's gotten much worse. I think, frankly, one of the turning points was 9/11, because we have become much more tolerant of militarism in our society. And there's a valorization of militarism, and then there's a much closer claim by police departments to be warriors, to use the term that came up already, to be part of the military. And then both Democratic and Republican administrations have been basically dumping surplus military equipment on them. Judge Cordell talked about Rhode Island. The University of Georgia police force, for a campus of 35,000 people, that has put aside public drunkenness. There's public drunkenness and sexual assaults, I guess I have to say. Those endemic college crimes, put those aside. It's not a challenging campus. They have their own Humvee bomb unit that clearly came from some federal dump of surplus military equipment. So those kinds of dynamics seem to make this different and make it much harder to push back. While we've been here, the man who sits in the White House has all cap tweeted, "I stand for law and order," with of course an exclamation point afterwards. And so it becomes really hard to talk about some of these things until people like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor give their lives to become unhappy catalysts for pressure for change. Can we sustain it? Can we sustain it during a pandemic? I guess I'm with Mr. Burris on that. I'm a bit skeptical, but I will leave on an optimistic note. I have hope from this discussion because it's been so rich, and it's great that we're talking.
Thank you, Diane. That was great. John Hamasaki, who's been waiting. John.
Thank you. Yeah, for some reason my video is frozen tonight, so I'm not sure what you are thinking.
We can hear you though. We can hear you.
Yeah, and that's probably yeah, the picture doesn't get any better. So so for those of you that don't know, I'm a San Francisco Police Commissioner, so this is directly in my wheelhouse, meaning I sit on the police commission that has oversight over SFPD. We do all of the policy, all of the oversight. We hire and fire the police chief. And we have pretty powerful and broad oversight responsibilities and powers. And I've sat on the police commission for about 2.5 years now. Prior to that, I'm a career criminal defense attorney. And thank you, Jim, for putting together this great group of speakers tonight, because everything that has been said tonight, or most of it, has been what I've seen directly in this role. And I have to say that I come down with Judge Cordell as the only realistic, reasonable, and practical outline of a solution. You can't, changing a culture through changing policies, through enforcing discipline, that helps around the margins. That can have an impact, but as has been discussed, I like our police chief. I think he's a good man. I think he's trying to do good work. But every few months, the police union calls for his resignation, or for us to fire him. They actively and regularly and constantly undermine him. And so all of the good work that he is trying to do and the commission is trying to do is undermined at every level of the department down to the patrol officers. So, I think when the demonstrations that kicked off after George Floyd, those were pretty hard, and not that, how it impacts me is particularly meaningful, but it made me realize the futility of a lot of the work that I had spent so many days, weeks, and late nights working on, that, it's not enough to work around the margins. And if we really can take a look at what happens and what's been happening to primarily Black and brown individuals in this country historically through policing, and let this moment pass, right? Because this isn't the first time we said Black Lives Matter, right? We said it about 4 years ago with Ferguson, with Michael Brown, and that moment too faded. And I think Mr. Burris and others expressed, that keeping the light on this, what a challenge it is. We have these hot moments where everybody's paying attention, but come January, how much are people going to care now that we have, a normal, sane person back in office, the Department of Justice in, at least non-criminal hands. And so, we really, until we really go at the goals that came out of this current movement, which is redirecting funding back towards the communities and the communities that have been starved of resources, to put it into the budget of the police, right? And if you look at a lot of the major city budgets, such a significant portion of the budget is dedicated to policing. And San Francisco, it's, I think 600, 700 million right now. And if we look back and say, why are the conditions that exist within Black communities, brown communities exist, is because, historically we starved these communities of resources. So we do need to redirect the funding back there. And we need to cut the police out of all of the issues that they've been placed in. And, we on the commission did a resolution back in February to remove the police from homeless response, right? There's been a lot of bad issues that have come up with homeless response by the police. The police don't want to do it. It's not what they were trained for. But we're spending, millions and millions of dollars to have police go and tell people to take down their tents. Substance abuse, mental health, all of these things, there's excellent professionals that can deal with these that are not carrying a badge and a gun and are not trained primarily in the use of force and defensive tactics. And so, there was a conservative commentator that said a line a few years back that he said he wanted to get government down to the size that he could drown it in a bathtub. I wouldn't go quite as far with policing, but we really do need to reimagine the role of policing in our society in order to make our society more equitable and fair for all people. Because right now, Black and brown communities are being, in a very real sense, many of these communities feel like they're living under occupation because of the manner in which we've deployed policing resources towards those communities. And then, finally, to Judge Cordell's point, community policing, that term means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But, when we just had a very, horrible incident in San Francisco where a 6-year-old was killed on the 4th of July. And the police are saying, why won't anybody speak out? Why won't anybody come to us? Why won't anybody tell us who did it? And it's because the whole community has been traumatized by the way the police have treated the community, that they have created, in a sense, an alternate source of justice, or an alternate means of resolving disputes that doesn't involve the police. And so, when we're talking about why we have unsolved crimes, like Judge Cordell mentioned in Camden, it's because there's all of this mistrust. So there's a lot of things and a lot of steps that we can do, and a lot of the things that people have mentioned tonight are part of the process. But it's going to take fundamental change and really changing the way that policing is contemplated in the society. It can't be the solution to every one of society's problems. And that's what we've done, which is, pulling the money from mental health, pulling the money from substance abuse, and more money to policing. So that's my summary and speech based on everything everybody was saying. But, this is a really valuable discussion.
Thank you, John. And, you're right there on the cutting edge. In San Francisco, you would hope would entertain reforms if any city can do it, but you spelled out the details of the problems. One thing that has not been mentioned, and this is so dated, I am the old man talking about what it was like in the 60s, when I know as soon as you say something like that, everybody stops listening. But the psychology of police officers has not been mentioned, and I did spend 5 years with them. And you can generalize about their feelings about authority and about being in charge. And many of them, I suspect today, are trying to do what they think is the right thing. I've got to believe that, otherwise we're not going to reform anything. But it's their psychology, is how they see the world, that fascinates me. It's you need Dostoevsky to really write a novel about the police and how they think and what they, from their standpoint, which is what good lawyers always do. You go around, look at it from their standpoint. And because I am conflicted, having defended for years, but having prosecuted for 5 years, I still remember cops who have to go up dark alleys and not know what's going to be there. And that is part of the job. And when they do things that they shouldn't do, it's all hell breaks loose, and it should, and I support that. I support those protests. And I don't think we have talked enough about it. What exactly is the idea that will bring intelligent reforms, meaningful and successful reforms, so that we don't have thousands of people in the streets night after night? That's a social priority right now. And I do think it has to be factored in. Who has not spoken? We do not allow shy people to come to the cafe.
I think at this point, anyone can just jump in, so.
We have some students here. We have Brian. Do you have a thought?
Hey, Professor. I'm just happy to, to hear this conversation. I think that even at a school like Berkeley Law, I haven't ever sat in in a room like this or had a conversation like this. And so I'm just, thankful to be here. And as you were saying, what's it going to take to drive this change? I'm at a loss for words. I don't know that there is the one thing that's gonna change everything. And I've heard a lot of great ideas today, and I think it's gonna take all of them and more. I wish I could give you a better answer, but I don't know.
Who else is there? Christian, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm a little bit hesitant to speak because I had to miss a part of the discussion, and I don't want to repeat something that's been said already. But I was speaking to Evan earlier today, and I would be really curious to know the correlation just between, this is stemming from my European perspective, of how many guns there are available on the street and how easy it is to obtain a gun, and then gun violence. Because it seems to me that the job of the police officer, as hard as it is made even more dangerous. And there is even more anxiety just by the possibility that any single suspect that you pull over, or any random person that you pull over, might have a gun or another weapon. That is one thing that I think would affect their psychology a lot, at least logically speaking. So this is one thing that I'm curious about. And other than that, I just reiterate, I want to just say what Brian said, that I'm just very happy to be here. And it's been really enlightening as a discussion to learn so much and to hear so many opinions.
I think it's not only the number of guns, but it's the size of them. And it's scary from them. Evan, what do you think? Yes. Need you.
Thank you. I was just amazed to be in this room. I'm just blown away by the people here, the judges, Mr. Burris, hearing from people who have other experiences, who have argued these cases. It was just unbelievable. I've worked in city government a little bit before grad school, and I also was a dual degree student at the policy school. So I took a class with Dan Lindheim on policing, and we used some of the data that had come from some of the things that Mr. Burris was talking about. We met with some of the former police chiefs and had some of those conversations, and I feel like I have a fuller picture now from hearing Judge Henderson speak and so many others. I mean, I think this is going to be one of the defining issues of the next 50 years, and I hear in everybody's perspective a lot of value. And I think it's a defining generational challenge. And I think that the protest movement and Black Lives Matter is bringing this tremendous energy that can really fuel reform. Because I think as a law student and someone who sat in these policy classes, I think it felt like we can see there's a lot of problems, but is there really will to make change? And I think now there really is. And it's clear that if you're going to be at least on the left politically, this has to be a major issue. So I guess just it brings me a lot of hope to hear all the sort of to hear from people who've been working on this for a long time. And I definitely feel hope looking at the way that people are mobilizing kind of at the grassroots level to make change here. I guess, yeah, I mean, if I had one question, it would just be like, you know, what could a lawyer do at the beginning of his or her career do to make a difference on this issue? I would just put that out there if anybody has ideas.
Well, I think if you're in the criminal justice system, you'll have daily issues about ethics and presentation in court, certainly. And there are an awful lot of lawyers on both sides that work hard on that. I remember I had an agent, I asked an agent one time, I said, what happened? And he said, what would you like to have happen? And he was in a drug case. And so I was just shocked that, you know, it was that open. That was unusual, but it was scary. And you have to deal with it, stuff like that. You have to deal with it. Raj Chatterjee, you've been absorbing all this. What do you think?
Oh, Jim, you put me on the hot seat.
Judge Chatterjee.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. I have been absorbing all this, and after the comment from just a few minutes ago, I was thinking about, are there studies that compare U.S. policing practices to practices in other countries, let's say Canada, England, Iceland, Western Europe? For example, I think in Iceland, a police officer needs to get permission before they can take out a gun after putting in a certain amount of information to their superiors, and then they get, you know, some level of cause before they can pull their gun out. And I believe in England still, police officers don't routinely carry weapons, and you know, look to other countries as models. And I just think in America we tend to be self-focused and not look to other countries as possible models from which we could learn something. And I'm just wondering if, for any of our panelists, have there been studies of international policing practices that we might want to at least study?
You know, I've looked at some of the work in other countries. It's John Burris. Some of the other countries on how they deal with the mentally impaired, emotionally impaired, and how in most of these cases they very easily subdue people, take them under control without killing them. And you know, that goes to the de-escalation. It kind of goes to not having hard-nosed police people there who are there as a felony stop. And so, yeah, there are those, but other areas, I know that other countries seem to have an easier time, but one of the things we cannot forget here is that there's the plethora of guns. And I think guns change the whole dynamics of the relationship between the police and the community, like it or not. And I think the officers are taught that just about everybody has a gun and they react to people that way. And instead of talking or using their best weapons, which is their voice, they are too quick to use force. And that's the most troubling component, because I'd often say, why'd you shoot him? Well, why'd you do that? You know, and it's almost as if they considered there were no other options. So, you know, I do think that there's efforts to look at other countries, but on the other hand, I don't think that that it could be much real movement around the totality of it, of policing, because of the guns that exist here.
If I could offer,
Diane.
Yeah, if I could offer a thought about that, it's really difficult to do those kind of comparisons because the political cultures are so different. Guns is one classic example. Virtually no other country in the world has our Wild West history. And so the US just tolerates violence a lot more. We also push it down a lot more. Even in some of the countries that are idealized, like Britain, in their communities of color, in their disadvantaged communities, there is widespread police misconduct, right? It may look good to the tourist, you know, next to the London Bridge, but if you go much farther from that, you're going to see pretty awful behavior. The other thing about England and other countries, I mean, if you go to London, you are under surveillance camera whenever you are outside.
Right.
Everywhere, every train, every street corner, every restaurant. And so if you have blanket surveillance, which they literally do, you may need cops less because you can always recreate the crime at the end. And so that's why it's hard to do those comparisons, because there are sort of hidden trade-offs that sometimes when you lift a couple layers off, you're like, oh, well, if that's how they do it, maybe that is not the bargain that I want.
That's
Jim, may I say something?
part of that problem in England is the Irish troubles that lasted for 25 years, and they had to do certain things as they saw it. But the other thing I would point out is we watch a lot of English detective stories, and it's involuntary with me. Morse will be going into some dark alley or something. He's got no gun. Never mind the permission to pull it. He didn't have a gun. And my reaction is, my God, don't go in there.
Jim, I have to jump in right now and just say that I have to go. It's about 8:30 and I have to take my leave. So I just say thank you, Thelton,
Thank
for
you so much.
bringing
Thank
me
you,
into the fold. And
LaDoris.
thank you, Jim. Thank
Yeah.
you, John. And thank you, Jim, for doing this Justice Cafe. I think it's terrific.
Yeah, you're
and
terrific. And thank you so much for taking your time and coming
Absolutely.
here. It was great to have you. I hope you'll come again, by the way. You get on the mailing list whether you like it or not. I mean, it's not,
I would like to, and I really appreciate it.
voluntary thing, you know. So
I got it. And I
Yeah.
really appreciate the comments from everyone tonight. So
Sure.
thank you so much.
Okay,
All right,
thank
take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else
It's
wants to
actually-
talk?
it's actually
Joe, did you
11:30 for
have yeah? Who?
It's
Anybody else?
11:30 for me, so I'm gonna be
Fine.
bugging out here as well.
Okay. Yeah, you're on the East Coast. John's
Yeah,
on the East Coast, and Diane's on the East Coast, sort of. And everybody, I think we're there. I agree. I want to thank the panelists and all the comments. We had some wonderfully substantive comments by people who've been there and done this kind of work. And I certainly enjoyed it. And I hope everybody did. I think in closing that the Zoom has some advantages. We don't have dinner together, which is we certainly will do again sometime. But in terms of having people from out of state and so forth, it's really good. John and Thelton Henderson, you were terrific as always. No surprise, no surprise. Thank you so much. We really
Thank you.
appreciate it. I'm going to give you a Zoom hand now.
Thank you all.
Thank you. My
Thank you.
pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much.
This is
All
great.
right,
As
I'm
All
always.
right,
leaving.
everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
See ya.